Last time we had these issues with speaker and microphone, right? Where was I checking it? Great. And I suppose microphone is working. Oh, we already have some people in waiting room. Sweet. Would you like to guys join me here? And because I mean, this is not the ordinary talk we are having in this session. Sorry? Like if you want to, you can just come over here and, you know, like anytime you will have a question or something. You know, as it is this kind of session, I take it as a bit more informal. Yeah, right. There is another person in waiting room, right? Yeah, I hope Patricia is going to join us soon. Do you have any questions prepared? No, I mean, any questions? No, I don't think so. All right. Yeah, last time you said you had finished it. Oh. Okay. No, it seems that. Sorry? No, it's all right.
We just want to give our members and people attending this talk a warm welcome.
Oh yeah, there it goes. Hello, Patricia. Can you hear us?
Yep, I can hear you.
All right, great.
I
Hello.
hear you fine. Hi.
How's it going?
Oh, it's going. It's kind of a crazy semester. I don't know how it is for all of you over there, but you know, it's kind of like everything's supposed to be normal, but it's not really. So it's just a weird vibe on campus, and students are pretty stressed out. Everyone's stressed out.
Is it already end of the semester?
No, we won't be ending until I give a final exam on December the 9th. So we have a 15-week semester.
Yeah, that's like, yeah, double the length than our semester.
Really?
Yeah, we have like 8 weeks terms. So
We have 3 of them, and we
And do you have like 2 or 3 of those in the course of an academic year? So you're on more what we call over here the quarter system? Yeah.
So 3 of them, basically.
Yeah, we're on the sort of the older semester system. So tell me a little bit about your group.
Well, we are basically archaeological society of undergraduate students mostly, but we welcome also like people who are like generally interested in archaeology, or also graduate and postgraduate students are coming to our talks. Most of our activities are talks. Basically, those are kind of lectures, not Q&A sessions as this one. So to be completely honest with you, this concept is brand new to us. This is the first time we are trying it. So I have to say that I am a bit stressed because most of the time it's only talk that guest speaker is giving, and then we have some follow-up questions afterwards. But yeah, today is going to be all about the questions. So yeah, it will be more in a discussion form, I suppose. I will, yeah.
So if everyone would like to turn on your cameras and be a little bit more, you know, present, then we can all talk and see each other. That would be nice. I think is what Liana was suggesting.
I couldn't hear you very well.
Oh.
If we could all turn on our cameras and have a discussion together, that might be nice.
Yeah, that would be great if I could see your faces. I don't know if you're all physically in the same place or if you're in different places.
So yeah, some of us are in the same room, and the rest is joining us remotely.
Okay.
Yeah. So apart from these talks, we organize also some social events from time to time. Hello. And yeah, we also plan to eventually do some kind of field work if it will work out as a group, but that's kind of a long-term plan. We will see about that, because like this society is supposed to have like 100-year history, and throughout that they were also doing some kind of archaeological research, but in a couple of last years it wasn't that active, and I know some things happened, also pandemics and stuff. So we are trying to restore it in a sense.
Yes, a resurgence. Yeah, a lot of things have gone by the wayside here, and our undergraduate archaeology club is in a rebuilding phase right now. So it is hard to keep things together when you can't do any archaeological field work. And so now you have to kind of just go back and press the restart button. So yeah.
So are you teaching also undergraduates?
Oh, yes. Right now, I'm chair of the department, but I also teach both undergraduate and graduate courses. And in fact, I'm teaching Maya archaeology this semester. So we just did I do a Halloween lecture in which I take in a big bag of Native American cultigens, and then students pick out something and identify it. And, you know, it's all sorts of things that, some of which they're familiar with, other things, you know, they've never seen before and they don't have any idea what it is. So it's kind of a fun lecture that we do.
Yes.
So interaction things. So we did that today. So that was nice. So shall we start with the questions since we don't have all that much time together?
Yes. Just to have some kind of system in all of this, those of us who are joining us remotely, feel free to raise your hands. There should be such function somewhere in the chat. Like at any point, if you will have question, and then you will be given a space to ask the question in the chat, or you can unmute your microphone and ask it. It's completely up to you. So yeah, and we will be kind of taking turns in asking the questions. So if no one objects against, I would be the first one to start with a question. Yeah, so I was reading one of the papers you sent us about the evolution of fragility, and you mentioned there this concept of monumental time, and I wanted to ask, like, how was it created and maintained within the particular society, this kind of concept of monumental time?
Yeah, that's a good question. And oh, I see. I still have my email open. Let me just close that out so you don't constantly hear dinging in the background. Okay, that's good. Okay, I've got that shut out. Okay, well, I think that when I started looking into when we work in the Maya area, something that we're always noticing is that there are a lot of these long count dates from the bar dot in the inscriptions, and they're where dates on the order of 100 years, 400 years, 400 years times 13, are being recorded. So these really like massive amounts of time. And oftentimes scribes are counting forward thousands of years and counting backwards thousands of years, and then placing a particular ruler right in the center, sort of indicating that they are in the center of these monumental folds of time. And so and in fact, that's what, I don't know if you remember the year 2012, when that came around, there were some crazy ideas that, oh, scribes had foretold the end of the world. And in fact, 2012 was the closing of one of those giant kind of epochs of time, and the seeding of a brand new cycle of this thing called a Baktun, which is a roughly 400-year cycle. So I started looking into this a bit more and thinking about how strange it is that in the northern lowlands, at really well-known sites like Chichen Itza and other places, very little use of the long count, but at the southern lowland sites where we find all these ancestor shrines and royal burials, we find much more extensive use of this. And I found that originally this very long count of time, massive units of time, was used to talk about the birth of patron deities that were specific to a place, so at Palenque, for instance, the patron deities, their birth dates are told. And, these are like going back thousands of years when supposedly this patron deity was first born or created or came into being. And the patron deity was the entity that really was closely linked to place. So it was this kind of identity with place that then became grafted onto rulership. And so I think originally it was a religious formulation that then got a bit hijacked and became a way of perhaps legitimizing rule or situating rulership within these large folds of time to kind of make it appear to be a sort of a very stable thing with a very deep pedigree, when in fact some of the dynasties did have a very deep pedigree, but many of them, maybe they could go back 100 years, if that, maybe 200 years. So I think that it was all about this notion of counting time in a monumental fashion was also about creating this aura of stability and kind of, the long-term nature of rulership, which in reality was not that stable at all. And that was something that was kind of constantly being contested and negotiated among this network of rulers, a dozen, 15 of these large royal courts that were kind of engaged in these constantly shifting alliances. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, completely. And so I wanted to ask whether there were some kind of different narratives being used in societies that didn't use this kind of monumental time counting.
Right. And I think that, sometimes people think, classic Maya, they're really like the quintessential Mesoamerican rulers. And, really the way in which ancestor veneration and the long count date and the kind of the emphasis on hereditary rulership through the male line, the way that really became so important in the southern lowlands. And so I'm talking here about Guatemala and areas like that. That was really quite different from how rulership was construed in the northern lowlands and what is like Yucatan, how the system of rulership that came to be at a place like Chichen Itza, and also the way in which rulers were chosen and ruled in the Mexican highlands, among the Aztecs at Tenochtitlan and earlier at Teotihuacan. There seems to have been much less emphasis. Of course, they knew of the long count. Of course, they venerated their ancestors, but they didn't really have that kind of emphasis on the sort of the patrimonial line of descent. And rulers tended to be chosen by councils, rather than by just someone, who happens to be the first son of the current ruler. And so we know this was the case, like among the Aztecs, that they had a concept of aristocratic nobility and all that stuff, but they did not they just didn't, when you think about it, the idea of inheritance by just simply your birthright, it's a really good recipe for getting really bad kings, bad kings and queens, because it's just whoever happens to be, they might be capable or they might be completely inept, it's leaving a lot to chance. And so to really vest in that. So we see that in other parts of Mesoamerica, for instance. There were kings and there were rulers, but they were most often kind of chosen after they had proved themselves on the battlefield and proved themselves in some diplomatic capacity.
All right, thank you.
So, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great, I get pulled on file. So I was reading your article, the article you mentioned then from 2020, and I was wondering, like in the context of the pandemic specifically, do you think that there's any that we should be looking at collapse differently than we did when you wrote Questioning Collapse?
Yes, certainly the pandemic has given us all pause, hasn't it? And it's confirmed some things that we already knew about the kind of the vulnerabilities of sort of the globalized system that we're moving towards in terms of, you know, supply chains. I mean, I don't know what you all are hearing over in the UK, but in the States, all we keep hearing is buy your Christmas gifts now because there won't be anything available on the shelves by December, you know? So that's just kind of one, and that's all linked to the pandemic and the hiatus in production, primarily in China, that occurred during the pandemic. And so I think that the vulnerabilities are certainly, you know, the pandemic has really cast a harsh raking light across that and brought those, you know, to the forefront. I mean, computer chips is another one, you know, that it's just really clear now that somehow in our quest to optimize production of computer chips and to outsource it all to Taiwan, that, you know, that was not necessarily a smart thing to do, given the fact that we might be necessary to maintain some viable production within, you know, at home. So for a number of reasons. So I think that when Norm Yoffe and I put together Questioning Collapse, we were really, of course, responding to Jared Diamond's book. And we both felt like we really don't have the time to do this book, but all of our colleagues were saying, somebody has to do this book. You guys have to do this book. And I think that what really rankled a lot of my colleagues who contributed to that book was the way in which Diamond conflated political cycling, you know, and this is, I mean, political cycling occurs. Political systems don't last forever because they're all about power and, you know, kind of negotiating power and yielding power to another person. And so they're always contentious and they're always questioned, and they don't last that long. And so with some notable exceptions. And so but Diamond really, he kind of stoked the fire of confusing political cycling with, I don't know what you might call cultural resilience, and the fact that even though you might have a political system that comes and goes, that the culture still exists. And it's in the Americas, I think this is particularly a key point because of the way in which the popular audiences tend to think about the end of the classic Maya period as simply the end of the Maya, you know, like they are somehow lose sight of the fact that there are, like, you know, over 7 million Mayan speaking people living today in southern Mexico and northern Central America, and who are living, you know, under very dire circumstances. And so in the Americas, I think this idea of collapse and kind of pointing a finger and saying, oh, I bet they also were ecocidal, you know, and this is obviously with Rapa Nui, you know, this was a really, this was a narrative that was often thrown out there, you know, oh, I bet they must have really messed up their environment. And actually the example I like to give to people to sort of just point out to them how ludicrous this is that, I mean, I don't know the latest, you know, paleobotanical data that's coming out around Stonehenge, but, you know, the last time I spoke with Mike Parker Pearson about Stonehenge, you know, nobody was saying, oh, Stonehenge, that was abandoned because they really screwed up their environment, you know, and then they all just left, you know. I mean, no, that's not what the narrative is at all, you know. Yes, there did come a time when Stonehenge stopped being used, or it went from one regime of use into another regime of use, like by Druids, or, you know, it's a group like that, you know. So I think that we just, sometimes our collapse narratives really echo kind of racist And in the Americas, they kind of feed into the settler colonialism and some of the tropes of settler colonialism that always disavow or try to negate any kind of achievements of the people who are being colonized, try to simplify their political situation. And so you don't have to kind of deal with on an equal basis, you know? So I think that there were issues like that were around the Questioning Collapse book that I wouldn't change even today.
So you mentioned with the Maya, we're looking at transformation of people voting with their feet and moving to different places that were more stable. In the current world, obviously with the refugee crisis, that seems to be a much more difficult situation. Considering the differences between the ancient world and the modern world, do you think we can apply lessons from other cultural transformations today, or do you think they're too different?
That's a really good question. And the movement of people out of the southern lowlands, you know, where we had this system of, you know, sacred rulers who were largely hereditary-based rulership. The big question about that remains is, why didn't people come back after maybe 50 years, 100 years? I mean, when Spaniards started moving around when they hit the beach in the 16th century and then started moving into the interior, they didn't see much of a population in there. And so, and that still remains a big mystery, why that area was not substantially repopulated. And it may just be that people left, they had relatives in the north, they had relatives along the coast, and they went and they lived with them and they made their life there. And there really just was no real compelling reason to return. And so, but, you know, that means that they had a place to go. And I worry about the diasporas that are occurring right now because there are places on the earth that are becoming unlivable, either because of climate change, you know, areas that are just being storms, and they're eventually, we know they're going to be going underwater, or areas that are just politically so fraught and dangerous, like especially in Central America with all the gangs warfare that's going on, that they're pushing people out of those areas. And the political situation in the US right now is such that those people are not being welcomed in the US. And so, but, you know, they do often have family connections. So they're trying to get to some place or another, you know, some Crete, Nebraska or someplace because they have a cousin there. And so I think that you see this, the way the diaspora works along, you know, these extended family networks, kin networks. But I don't know whether the hostility that these refugees, if we want to call them that, if we want to think about refugees from the late classic period, I don't know if that would be the appropriate term or not. But, you know, I don't know if they were welcomed in the places to which they moved any more warmly than some climate change refugees are being welcomed today. So there is a sense that, well, the world is full today, but you know, the Maya lowland region at the end of the classic period was a pretty populous place. There were millions of people living there. So it wasn't, you know, it wasn't empty space. It wasn't an empty space at all. So though that's a very good question, and it's a difficult question. And I've kind of asked myself that that same question: how identical would these situations be, or are they just really very, very different? I don't know.
I guess we'll find out.
You touched on a few potential answers to this question earlier, but I was wondering what you would say is the biggest either public or academic misconception about the concept of collapse.
Yeah, I think that this notion that it is an ending. And I think that we're, the first time a friend said to me, a colleague said to me, well, you know, this is all biblical. I was like, what are you talking about? And then, you know, I went back and read, you know, the book of Revelations. And, you know, I was raised Catholic, and, you know, Catholics don't read the Bible. And I said, oh, yeah, okay. I see this sort of Judeo-Christian tradition of these end times, and that where things really go bad, they go bad really in a really hard way. And then that's it, it's the end. And so I think that we do have a tendency in Western scholarship anyway to really kind of, you know, want every archaeological instance that we're working with to be like something out of the book of Revelations, you know, to be like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, you know, are riding in. And I think that some of the, I mean, a lot of people have pointed out for the Maya region that this all unfolds over a period of 100, 150 years. And so it's a really pretty long unfolding. And then it looks like the palaces, the royal courts were abandoned first, and then the kind of populations around that, they might stay on for a couple of generations before, because they're, you know, we're getting a settlement signature that is much later than what we get in the royal courts themselves. And so this, you know, took place over a long period of time. And then there was a resurgence, you know, granted not in the southern lowlands, but in the north, you know, so that, and Mayapan, which really integrated a lot of northern polities together, it blew apart just, you know, a couple of decades before Spaniards arrived. And so I think that, you know, really thinking about, I would say, maybe a better term than collapse is thinking about this political cycling that happens when you have particular constellations of power that gel, they coalesce, and they work for a while. They work until they don't work, and then they fracture along whatever lines of vulnerability and fragility, you know, are pre-existing. And then something else, you know, comes in its place to take its place.
So then would you say that there is anything in archaeology or history that really is discontinuous enough to be characterized as a collapse, or is collapse really more of a useless made up term of our own historiography?
To try to dramatize what we're doing?
Yeah.
Well, I think that it is true that political systems don't last forever, and that they dissolve. James Scott likes to use the term, they disassemble. You know, they disassemble. That's sort of a little less dramatic, and so. I think, you know, the classic example, and you all are closer to this than I am, but is, you know, the Roman Empire, and, you know, the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. We all sort of were raised with that that trope, but yet, you know, newer scholarship has kind of started to pick it apart and also ask, well, you know, if we hadn't seen the end of the Roman Empire, would we see modern Europe today? You know, because it kind of, in that, you know, dissolution of the imperium, then other things came to take its place that begin to look like kind of precursors to, you know, modern European states. And so I think that one could make a case that the word collapse is to suggest an ending and a period at the end of a sentence in a way that is too emphatic, based on the empirical evidence that we have as archaeologists. But at the same time, I think there's no denying that political systems come and go.
You have mentioned earlier that this hereditary system within the societies creates potential for fragility. So I wanted to ask, like, how impactful can we say that like decisions of single individual in position of power could have been on stability of society they kind of governed?
In a system of rulership, you mean, or?
Yeah, so basically, like, can we say that like individuals had very large impact on stability of the society, or were there like long-term ongoing processes which they couldn't impact by effectively by their decisions?
Yeah, so you might be trying to get at to what extent the sort of the great man in history or the great woman in history narrative is at play here. And I think that we really grapple with that within Maya archaeology, because even though the decipherment was so fabulous because it provided us with the names of rulers, of kings and queens, from this largely 200-year period at in the late classic times between 600 and 800. But at the same time, we then began to obsess over those individuals and the alliances that they created with other royal courts, and we know their children, and then what structures their children built, and whether their children built their temple structure, their funerary temple structure or not. So, it has been alleged that in doing that, we're just simply falling back into the old, great people in history kind of mantra, a way of thinking about the past and taking agency away from the many other people that were part of this thing we call, the late classic world, Maya world, for lack of a better term. And the one thing that is really, I think, really obvious to everyone is that these late classic royal courts were really vested in attracting as many people as possible. So we were just talking about refugees a minute ago, and one thing we know is that during late classic times, any refugees would be welcome. And because the more people you had living around your court, the more people you had to help with construction projects, pay taxes, do this, do that. And so they were very much, and that if people began to leave for some reason, if they perceive that, oh, gee, this ruler just keeps losing battles with this court and that court, and we're having to pay all this extra tribute to these other places, and I don't really think I want to be here anymore. If people start, voting with their feet, as I mentioned, the royal court is really in trouble. They really are losing everything that gives them their power and legitimizes their rule. So I think that we do have to really balance the fact that the royal courts, the nobility who lived there had a tremendous amount of power, and power and status was not equitably distributed at all. At the same time, there were certain checks on their power and certain limits to their power that need to be recognized. And some of that is, even though Maya rulers would dress up as, the maize deity, or dress up as the Chalk, the rain deity, and they would, try to, in effect, channel those deities and effect a concurrence with them to bring rain and to bring a good harvest to their to their polity. You know, they obviously they weren't always successful, and the reasons they were not successful will totally beyond their control. Like the rains don't come; they can't really make the rains come, or there's, you know, locusts that come and eat all the corn or something like that. So they were in kind of a tight position there, because they were, as sacred rulers, they were supposed to have a special channel of communication with these non-human powers and spirits, and yet, you know, they really didn't have any power to affect change there. So and likewise, you know, how much power did they have if people started leaving their courts? Could they hold people there? Probably not, you know. And so, you know, you begin to see how their power was constrained in ways that they shouldn't kind of, if you focus only on them, then, you know, you lose sight of kind of the overall thing and overall, you know, how the whole constellation of factors came into play to make something work or not work.
All right.
I don't know, that was kind of a long-winded answer, but maybe I got there.
Yeah, thank you. In the reading, you've also mentioned the experimentation as in a sense of like societies testing the political forms. So I wanted to ask if we at this point in history, or like in nowadays, if we've already reached a point where we don't experiment anymore with our like political formation, or and because we are in kind of ideal position already, or if there are still some forms in which we kind of experiment in this way as well with the political forms.
Yeah, that's a good question. And, you know, I think that I have that one section in there where I talk a little bit about these category of sites called large anomalous sites, that this is Roland Fletcher's term. And these sites that are like too big and too early, and they really do seem to be these experiments in large group aggregation, and how that might be affected. So I think that those are kind of exciting and interesting, you know, and maybe, you know, when archaeologists always like to say, oh, I have the earliest, biggest, this or that, you know, and so this might be a way in which, you know, that is really pretty interesting. Normally I say that's not very interesting, but, you know, I think it might be. So then it is interesting that as it then becomes kind of settles into this thing that we call early civilizations, and there are like, you know, 5, 7 of them globally, that, you know, they really all have a lot of similarity. I mean, they're of course culturally specific, but you know, they're similar in a way that we recognize them as being all instances in which there's really very large group aggregation, pronounced inequality, some sort of system of governance that is giving rise to a kind of almost like a professional class of rulers. And then I think that, you know, there is a kind of, sometimes folks use the term path dependency, that, you know, that you sort of, once you set down one path, it's kind of really hard to veer off that and create something completely different. So I think that we do kind of get entrenched in certain political forms, and you certainly can see that. You know, we seem to be in this stage now of, you know, territorial nation states, and that's, you know, that's what everyone is supposed to be organized into around this world. And how they do that internally and who represents them at the UN is is somewhat variable, but not all that variable. But then, you know, we just went through a period of having a president who really tried to flaunt all the rules and protocols of what the US democracy is supposed to stand for, and really pushing it towards being more authoritarian. And, you know, it was really amazing to watch how easy it was for him to do that, and to realize how much of what we live in, this thing we call this US democracy, is a kind of a social contract that doesn't really have, you know, there's a lot of things that there's just simply no law against it. It's just that no one would ever think of doing that, because it's not in the spirit of what this governmental entity or organizational form is all about. So I think that, you know, that sort of experimentation is you see it going on all around us now. It's not a kind of experimentation that I think is very healthy, but the way in which these sort of democratic systems are being pushed towards more authoritarian systems is, you know, we see that happening in a number of places right now. And that is a kind of experimentation, but I think a very dangerous one.
Do you have any other questions, or? All right. Anyone else has any questions they would like to ask, or am I allowed to?
Can I quickly want to ask one question before I dash off? Hello, Patricia. So in the book, you kind of explained that how problematic the term of collapse might be. And you pointed out that there is continuality, there is resilience. So I guess the next question will be naturally why certain areas, certain places have this sort of continuality, this sort of resilience, or they have higher levels of resilience than other areas. Let's say, for example, in the Maya area, we have a lot of cities abandoned, but in some areas like the Mcnanay site, you still see things continue going on until the Spanish come, and even after the Spanish conquered that area, there are still the old rituals performed.
Yeah, I think that that's, you know, that's a pretty interesting pattern. And even, you know, one could go to the center of the Petén in Laguna Petén Itzá, where the Itzá, you know, set up in the post-classic. And so, you know, it does seem, and this is sort of, I think, comes to my point of why it's dangerous to use a sort of a totalizing term like collapse for something that occurred over 100, 150 years. So it's a very long process of, as Scott would say, disassembly. And it's not totalizing in the sense that it took place everywhere. Some places stayed more intact than others. And so I think that, and why that is the case, I didn't know if you had not been able to pay your light bill or what, or if you're on a timer.
Because I'm not moving, so the light just went off.
Oh wow, okay. That's very green. So I think that those are all really good questions. Obviously, people will often, for like Mcnanay, people will turn to the fact that, well, it was on a major waterway, you know, at the top of the New River, and that even, you know, when Spaniards were moving around in that area, it was sort of a natural portage site to get to the Belize River, and then into the Petén. So it's, you know, did it have something like geographically strategic about it, you know, going on for it that that resulted in its just being able to just continue on and not um, and not go by the wayside. In, you know, the general pattern at the end of the Classic period is a hollowing out of the interior of the Maya region, especially the Central Petén, and then with folks moving, especially to the coastal areas where we see a big buildup of population in the post-Classic, the Terminal Classic and the post-Classic. And so the, and Mcnanay, you know, I would almost include that in as a coastal area, even though it's more of a riverine site, but it's, you know, the new river there is like a big long inlet, you know, in from the Bay of Corozal. And it's, you know, there are crocodiles, sea crocodiles and everything that go up and down that live in that river. And so I think that in that case, it may have been its geographical locale as a kind of more of a coastal port, even though it's in the interior.
Alyssa, do you want to ask your question?
Pardon me?
I might be the only non-student here. So I have more of a technical question. So the notion of these two interpretations of the archaeological record, one that things are, you know, that material culture is evidence of a new group conquering another group, which is what you've talked about already, but is there a shift in the field now toward more interpretation of that as trade and influence instead of as conquest?
Trade and influence as opposed to conquest.
Yeah, like cultural exchange.
Yeah, I could you be more specific? Is there something I said specifically that you could indicate that I could use to address that?
Well, I was thinking of the city of Teotihuacan,
Mm-hmm.
and that has many layers of occupation going up to the Aztecs. And so the material finds there have been, you know, have been influenced by Maya culture in one place and
Mm-hmm.
something else in another. So I think that's the example I'm thinking of.
Yeah, so I think with Teotihuacan, I mean, that's such a fascinating example because there obviously was a Maya presence along the Avenue of the Dead at what I call the Maya consulate, you know, at Teotihuacan. And something went terribly awry there because, you know, the whole place ended up being burned down. Then shortly thereafter, you know, you have the Teotihuacan warriors down in the Maya lowlands. So I don't know. I say when things happen that are that impassioned, you know, there's probably something having to do with an arranged marriage that went wrong or terribly wrong or something like that. But I think that we feel that it would have been too far that the Maya region and Teotihuacan are too far separated from each other to have had an invasion and an occupation, you know. At the same time that I'm saying that, you know, it's becoming really very clear that when Teotihuacanos came down into the Maya region in the late 200s, early 300s, that they were able to effect regime change at several places and install new rulers who were, you know, in some cases dressed as if they were Teotihuacanos. And so I think that, you know, we're beginning to understand this as not exactly invasion, but that the Teotihuacan was so strong and so influential that they were able to affect a change of government and, and interrupt a line of succession, in the southern lowlands at places like Tikal, at Rio Azul, and there's a couple other places where it may have occurred also. And then we see within 1 or 2 generations, everything's back to the normal kind of Maya iconography and stuff like that. So in a sense, I guess they did invade, but it probably wasn't a huge force, but it was more like some high-level diplomatic wrangling that was going on. That was the sort of force of that was, no doubt there were Teotihuacan warriors that were kind of standing behind that. So I think that we've kind of, and the hieroglyphs, have of course helped us to understand the subtleties of this. And even in the late classic period after 600, when Teotihuacan is really no longer a major force in the highlands, still the image of a Teotihuacan warrior is very influential in the Maya lowlands. And so late classic rulers show themselves dressed like a Teotihuacan warrior. Obviously they're not, they have Mayan names and everything, but it's the cachet of that really lingered on for hundreds of years really, and was then in some ways kind of resurrected by Aztecs in the post-classic period. I don't know if I answered your question there.
No, you did. I like that, it's a fascinating concept that this is sort of became a sign of cachet, that even after that entire city and civilization was gone. I was thinking about it because I worked an exhibit on Teotihuacan at the Fine Arts Museum in San Francisco. So it's always been as a fascinating place to dig more into.
Oh yeah, it's amazing, and what's coming out of, especially right along the Avenue of the Dead, there is really changing our ideas. Putting that together with what we know hieroglyphically from the lowlands, we're really reconsidering it, and I think. There's sort of this high-level diplomacy that was going on, these alliance making, alliance breaking, that, I think we're getting a whole new appreciation for that. And so, the discussions of it are now, we're realizing how much more sophisticated it was than our sort of very blunt discussions of, well, was it invasion or was it just trade? And, I remember that's where the discussion was when I was in graduate school. And, now with all this new evidence, it's really moved beyond that. And we're getting a whole new appreciation for just like how sophisticated statecraft was back then.
Right. If I may question on a bit lighter note, I would like to ask, how did academic circles react to the publishing of Jared Diamond's collapse, and what was the reaction of the academic circles basically when you came up with a response?
Well, I think that people were really overwhelmingly happy that there was some kind of response coming out of the academic community to Diamond's collapse book. And so initially we did a session at the AAA meetings, the American Anthropological Association, and they gave us like a prime slot, and then the Amarin Foundation hosted us for a seminar, and then, Beatrice Reel at Cambridge Press, where we published it, she gave us, a special editor to try to help to translate academies into a language that might be a little bit more suitable for an audience of people beyond, you know, the finite number of archaeologists and historians who exist in the world. So, and you know, it was really interesting because I also found that whenever I would bring up the work of Jared Diamond to any scholars persons of color, that they would just like immediately recoil in horror at him, you know, like they really saw it as his scholarship as this like kind of privileged white man view of things. And I had problems with it, but I was like trying to articulate why I had problems with it and exactly what it was, other than its inaccuracies and the way that he would cherry pick evidence for only evidence that supported his point of view. So I think that there was just a lot of appreciation within the field. And, you know, some people did say to me, look, you really shouldn't do this. It's, you know, you're not going to write something that's going to be a bestseller because it's an edited volume. Edited volumes are never bestsellers, you know. And I said, it's, you know, it's okay. I don't think we're really trying to do that. I think we're just trying to. And some people said, well, you're just jealous of Jared Diamond and his, you know, his financial success with selling books. I was like, well, not really. We just want a better story out there. And sure, we would hope that a lot of people would read it, but we're not, you know, I'm never jealous of any author's success. An author who can sell books, that's great. But in this case, the story was just off, you know, that was being peddled. So we got both encouragement and dissuasion from our colleagues. But in the end, I think everyone was really happy to have it out there and to be able to point to that and have their students read a chapter or something out of it in whatever they were teaching.
Was there any response from Jared Diamond to your book?
Oh yes, he this was so crazy. He was allowed to review the book. And I think it was in Nature. I think it was Nature. They allowed him to review the book. And we were like, what? You know, the whole book is critical of his scholarship. Why would they ask him to review it? That's just ridiculous. So, you know, of course, you know, he tried to tear it apart. And then Norm and I could send you this whole interchange if you're interested. Then Norm and I and everybody else wrote a letter to the editor that finally got published, and they're saying, this is ridiculous. Why would you have him review our book? Because it's a critique of his book. And I don't know if they just didn't know it or if they did it purposefully to try to stir the pot a bit, you know. But he didn't like it, and he thought it was a lot of happy talk. So there you go.
Okay. And yeah, like one of the last questions, I suppose, is what is your current research? What are you working on at the moment?
Well, a number of things. I have an edited book that is based on a conference that we held last year called Faces of Rulership in the Maya region. And that is about the kind of the many variations on rulership that existed. And then I have a collaborative project, and kind of a community archaeology project going on in a little town called Tacabo in Yucatan, in eastern part of the northern Yucatan Peninsula. And that's a colonial site that has the remains of a church, early colonial church. And so we're working with the community about on plans for like how to kind of how to present the church to visitors, and we've put a little museum together with the community and things like that. So I have that going on. So, and then we're doing a project actually here in North Carolina with a Native American community called the Lumbee Indians, who are recognized by the state. And it's a project, it's about a reform of the curriculum in the grade schools in North Carolina to infuse, it's called Amplifying Native Voices in North Carolina School Curriculum, you know, to really have more content about Native Americans that kids are taught in 7th, 8th, 9th grade. So a few things going on.
Thanks. Are there any other last questions?
None that we have time for.
Yeah, I actually have to go to a meeting for that, actually, to decide where questions for. We're putting together an interview with an author by the name of Alan Gallet, who wrote this book called Indian Slave Trade, which is definitely not happy talk. And we're putting interview questions together for him. That's going to be part of the curriculum, a taped interview with him. So I better run, but this has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much for inviting me. And thanks also for your flexibility and making it a Q&A session. I really appreciate that. That was made it look like it. Okay. Okay, take care. Be safe, everyone.
Thank you, you too.
Bye.
Bye.